Okay, let's make a guitar neck.
1, 2, 3, 4!
Since the last episode, I've done quite a little bit of work off camera on this just to get things moving along. And to answer a couple of queries that I had in the comments, yes, I am going to screen the whole thing. As you can see here, I'm putting some copper tape onto the back of the pick guard. I will also do the cavity, but obviously there's no point in doing that just yet. I need to wait until I've finished getting it painted. With that done and everything reassembled, I've then taken a little bit of time to actually wire all the pickups in, because as was discussed last week and kind of quite heavily commented on, I've taken the decision to add in a couple of channels just for the wiring to go through from the pickups, so we can take the pick guard off pretty much without having to touch the wiring. When I add the bridge ground, I will have to incorporate a way of disconnecting that from the pick guard so I can just take it off. But other than that, it should be a really straightforward process. And as we can see now, the whole thing just slots in place really easily, very nicely. So there's no issues there whatsoever anymore. I want to give a big shout out to both Pete and Tim from the comments section, who both mentioned the channels for the wiring to go through even before I had a chance to publish the last video where I mentioned it. So great minds think alike and all that. So with all of that done, we can actually get this body out of the way for a little while and start to do a little bit of work on the neck. And that means we have to break out this great big chunk of maple and start working it down into something that resembles a neck an awful lot more. Now, I've done some checks on this and the face on the top is pretty flat, so we don't really need to worry about that too much. And the sides have been machined pretty nicely to 90 degrees from that face. From there, we've pretty much got everything that we need to progress with this. Now, it might surprise you to learn that I'm not actually going to make a bunch of templates for this neck. I'll do one for the headstock, because that is quite a specific shape and we'll need to route that to shape. But the rest of it I can pretty much do from measurements. And to that end, I've got kind of at least a partial drawing of where I need to be, so I can find out where my nut line and everything else needs to be. And I've got another one that kind of gives me the detail around the volute that I'll need. Additional to that, I've made a load of notes from the drawing and from other sources around the scale length, etc. So pretty much a lot of this is going to be measuring, marking and cutting out till we get something that's kind of relatively close to what we need, and then we can start to refine that into the neck that we actually need. I do get a couple of comments every now and again about stuff not looking square, or it might be twisted or something. My bench top isn't exactly flat all the way along, so sometimes with longer bits of wood you do get a little bit of rocking. It's more than likely to be the bench and not the wood. And as is always the case in these situations, the first thing we need to do is get a centre line onto here. And this is looking to be about 103 mil there. Yes, 103 mil. Pretty consistently along the length of there. So if I set my gauge up for about 51 and a bit, I don't have to be kind of smack on the centre of this. We're going to be cutting away a huge amount of material from this. But our centre line will be the basis for everything that we're going to do. I'll just get some pencil into that. And next up, we're going to need a nut line. That's the next important thing. Now, I took some measurements, and from the heel to the nut has to be about 465 mil. So we've got absolutely loads of material. But I also need to make sure I've got enough material for our headstock. So I'm thinking I can leave 300 mil. That is going to be absolutely loads. And then I can measure our 465, which is there. Probably cut it off a little bit away from that. So that's our centre line, and this is our nut. Always mark them up because you never know, you get confused if you get too many lines on, so at least we know what those represent. Now next up is we need to kind of measure out for our truss rod as well. I'm going to take that back just ever so slightly from the knot line to leave us some material. We can mark that on. And with those dimensions established, we can now break out the router and get the channel cut for this truss rod. We can't fully install it yet because there's some work we need to do after we've kind of angled the headstock back, but for the time being we can at least make a start on it. I'm going to use the big router to get this truss rod in because it's just a bit more stable and does a nicer job, and I can also kind of control the plunge a lot better on this one than I can on the little trim router. And I've set this up with a little V-point bit that you might just be able to see there, and that's set up so the point is right into the centre line. And I've just tested it by tracking this along, and it does follow the centre line pretty well. What I'll do now is I'll swap this out without changing the fence setting at all for a 1/4 inch straight cutter, and we can use that to actually get this rod in. So I've actually got two routing operations to do on this one. I need to use a normal straight 1/4 inch cutter for the bulk of the channel for the rod to go into. And then for the little recess that we're going to have underneath the truss rod cover, I'm going to use this bullnose bit just to kind of make a nice little smooth recess there that will leave a nice kind of shape once we cut that angle onto the headstock. But whatever I do, I'm going to keep the fence setting exactly the same so that all of the routing operations will be dead center on the neck. Okay, so that's the truss rod channel cut. Obviously we can't fit it yet because we've still got the adjuster to account for. But this is where we really need to start thinking about what we're doing and pay a lot of attention to it, because the potential for going wrong here is quite great and we really don't want to do that. Now I'm going to go a little bit off piste on this build. I'm not going to do it exactly the same as Johnny's guitar. The reason being is I'm not a fan of 0 frets and I don't like the floating nut setup that is on the original. It's going to be very difficult to replicate, and I think it's just going to be much easier and efficient for me if I just put a normal nut onto here. So a few purists might be going a little bit crazy right now, but that's the way I'm going to do it. And that means we're going to have a slightly different starting position for the headstock. I've kind of brought it back about 5mm from where it would start on the original guitar. At the end of the day, it's a small compromise. I don't think it'll be kind of that noticeable, but it will make my life a hell of a lot easier. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to route in the access for the truss rod adjuster. And as I said earlier, I've got a bull nose cutter that I can do with, which will leave a nice rounded kind of cutout in there. But first I need to establish exactly where it is I need to be cutting that recess out at. And the way I'm going to do that is just establishing where the adjuster on the truss rod finishes. And that wants to be in a little way in from our adjuster access. Because what we can do is we can cut that access in and then we can drill a hole through to the main channel so that this will poke through it. To that end, I'm actually going to put my adjuster in to there. I'm probably going to go about 30 mil. And I think I'm going to set this up so that I can plunge down about 10 or 11 mil into there, and that should give me enough depth to be able to drill that hole through to access into that truss rod channel. And that's that little channel cut there. I just nibbled the edge ever so slightly, but it hasn't gone down that far. So I think once we kind of put the angle onto this headstock, we'll lose that. So I'm not really particularly worried about that. Okay, so now we need to get this out of the vise and start marking up so we can actually cut this into a guitar neck shaped object. And you might just be able to see I've actually marked this on already. There's a line going down from the break angle at the end of the neck at 7 degrees, which is the headstock angle. However, that isn't the line we need to cut to. I've made a little bit of a template just out of some cardboard so I can get a better idea of what I'm doing, because you might be able to see that it actually swoops down a little bit before we get to the angle, which means that this is going to go just slightly below that line that I've put in, but we've got plenty of scope there to fit this in. So I'm going to start marking that out now. I'm just going to line this template up along the top of the neck. And you can see there that's running kind of pretty parallel to the 7 degree line that I marked in, so I'm quite happy that that's where we need to be with this. I'm going to mark the end and the thickness, but I'm not going to cut either of those just yet. I'm going to mark in where we need to be with the volute. However, this is bringing in another issue that I want to talk about, and that is neck thickness. Because these Mosrites had notoriously skinny necks. I like a bit more heft to my neck. I like a chunky neck, so I'm going to make mine a little bit thicker. At the moment that is about 16 mil, and then we've got 6 mil ish of fingerboard to go on top of that, which only gives you about 21 mil thickness at that point. What we need to bear in mind is that we've gone down about 11 mil with our truss rod channel, so that's not going to leave us a huge amount of material between the end of the truss rod and the back of the neck. I mean, happily we've got this big volute area which will reinforce it quite a bit, but it's a little bit too close for comfort for me, so I'm going to kind of add on a little bit extra meat into that department, but I'm not going to actually go near that just yet. I'm going to cut out the headstock angle, kind of get somewhere near with that, and then I'm going to cut the whole neck blank the same thickness as the heel for the time being, just so I can actually get the laying out work done. Now it might seem that I'm taking this quite slow and not making a huge amount of progress at the moment, but these early stages in a neck build are very, very important. One mistake here and you're restarting basically. Once we get this out of the way and establish where everything's going, it should move on a little bit quicker. But for the time being, I'm just being very methodical, taking my time, triple checking everything, and hopefully we'll end up with a great neck. Anyway, let's get the rest of this marked out. Okay, well I think we're pretty much good to go there. So I'm just going to go over to the bandsaw and swap out the blades because the one that's in there at the moment is a little bit too skinny for this work. And I'll get back to you in a minute and we can start to get this trimmed out. And I think that was kind of working at the absolute limit of my little bandsaw, but we seem to have got pretty straight cut. We're not bad. We've got a little bit of cleaning up to do and we're not quite down to the line, but we are kind of very much in the ballpark. I think what I needed to do was extend my little cut a kind of a little bit further along there. I'm not sure that I've got the scope to do that now I've put this angle on. Other than that, I think we are kind of pretty much where we need to be. So next up, I want to see if I can get the hole drilled into there so we can get this truss rod into position. I'm not sure that we will with having that extra material there. If not, we'll just have to kind of figure out a way of routing this down a little bit further. Okay, and that's that drilled through, so we'll just slide that into position. That all goes in really nicely, and we'll just see if we can get an Allen key onto that to adjust it as well. So that's absolutely brilliant. Now in terms of this little bit here, I actually kind of dug quite a bit of it out with the drill bit when I was drilling through there, and it's kind of almost got me into the ballpark of where I need to be. So I think I'm just going to take a little gouge and just kind of clean that up, probably by hand, just to get it to the shape that I want. So that's kind of planed down somewhere near where we need it now. There's still a little bit of work to do, but we're kind of in the ballpark. Now normally I would set this up on my oscillating spindle sander and use that to sand in this radius and potentially clean up the rest of this. However, you might have remembered from the first episode of this that my oscillating spindle sander is now broken and isn't oscillating, which means there isn't enough scope for this to travel the full width of this neck. So as things stand, the only way I'm going to get this anywhere near the shape is with some good old-fashioned hand sanding on a radius block, and just kind of work at this until I get it nice and smoothed out, and from there I can just use a normal sander on here and get it smoothed down to an acceptable finish. But I've obviously got a good hour's worth of sanding to do on this. So I'm going to do it off camera, and that means this is as good a place as any to leave this episode. So I'll be back in a few days' time when we can crack on and get this a lot nearer to its finished shape. So until then, don't forget to hit the like button if you've enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.